Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now let's dive into the story. The rifle left Kessler's hands before she could tighten her grip. Commander Harwick stood 3 feet away, his fingers wrapped around the barrel like he owned it, like he owned her. The Nevada sun pressed down on the training yard, turning the sand white-hot beneath her boots. 8 Navy SEALs formed a semicircle behind him, their arms crossed, their faces carved from stone and superiority. She could smell their contempt mixed with gun oil and sweat. Her weapon, the one she'd carried through 14 months of hell in Yemen, the one she'd cleaned every night like a prayer, hung in his hands like a toy he'd just confiscated from a child. "You think you belong here, Sergeant?" Harwick's voice carried across the yard, loud enough for the entire forward operations base to hear. The other trainees had stopped mid-exercise, frozen like deer sensing a predator. Kessler's throat went dry. She'd been Army Special Forces for 6 years, had survived ambushes that turned grown men into ghosts, had earned 3 commendations for valor under fire. None of that mattered now. Here, at the Joint Special Operations Training Facility outside Reno, she was just a woman trying to prove she could run with the Navy's elite. And Harwick had made it his personal mission to break her. She met his eyes without blinking. "Sir, I earned my place here." Her voice came out steady, but inside, her heart hammered against her ribs like it wanted to escape. The SEALs behind Harwick shifted, a collective movement of judgment. She recognized the look. She'd seen it her whole career. Men measuring her against an invisible standard she could never quite reach, no matter how many targets she hit, how many miles she ran, how much blood she spilled for the flag on her shoulder. Harwick smiled, and it was the cruelest thing she'd seen all week. He raised her rifle above his head like a trophy. "This weapon stays with me until you prove you can handle what we do here. Until then, you train unarmed." He turned to his men. "Maddox, Reeves, Chen, Torres, Kovac, Dutch, Samuels, Brinks, show Sergeant Kessler what real operators look like. Combat scenario. Full contact. She survives 5 minutes. Maybe I reconsider." The SEALs moved forward as one, their boots crunching against sand and gravel. Kessler's hands curled into fists. 5 minutes. Against 8 of the Navy's finest warriors. No weapon. No backup. Just her body and whatever was left of her pride after Harwick had stripped it away in front of everyone who mattered. The first SEAL, Maddox, cracked his knuckles and grinned like Christmas morning had arrived early. Behind her, someone started a timer on their watch. The clicking sound echoed in her skull. She had 73 seconds before everything changed forever. She just didn't know it yet. 6 weeks earlier, Kessler had driven through the gates of Joint Special Operations Command with her duffel bag and a letter from General Mathias himself. The letter said she was exceptional. It said she'd earned this chance. It said nothing about the wall of ice she'd hit the moment she stepped into the briefing room and saw Harwick's face. He'd looked at her like she was a stain on his pristine record, a political checkbox forced onto his roster by people too far from the battlefield to understand what combat really demanded. The training facility sprawled across 1,200 acres of desert scrubland. All razor wire and cinder block buildings painted the color of sand. She'd been assigned Barracks C, a converted storage unit that smelled like diesel fuel and disappointment. Her bunkmate was a Marine sniper named Graves who spoke 3 words a day and spent every evening cleaning a rifle that already gleamed like jewelry. The other candidates were men, all of them Army Rangers, Air Force Pararescue, Marine Raiders. They'd welcomed her with the kind of silence that screamed volumes. She'd trained harder than everyone. Up at 4, running 15 miles before breakfast while the desert sky turned from black to purple to burning gold. She outshot 70% of the candidates on the range, her groupings tight as a fist at 300 yards. During navigation exercises through the mountains, she'd finished 2nd overall, behind only a ranger named Crost who'd grown up hunting elk in Montana. None of it mattered. Harwick watched everything through narrowed eyes, finding fault in her breathing, her stance, the way she held her coffee cup in the mess hall. The other SEALs followed his lead. They didn't speak to her directly, but she heard the whispers in the hallways, felt the weight of their judgment every time she entered a room. Only one man had been different, Chan, a quiet operator from San Francisco who'd once nodded at her after she'd nailed a hostage rescue scenario that had stumped half the class. It wasn't friendship, but it wasn't hatred either. It was enough to keep her going when the loneliness threatened to swallow her whole. Her father had been Special Forces too, back when it meant something different, before the wars that never ended and the politics that poisoned everything. He died in Kandahar when she was 19, killed by an IED while trying to save a convoy of wounded soldiers. His last letter to her, written the night before he died, sat folded in her wallet. "Be better than they think you can be," he'd written. "Then be better than that." She'd carried those words through Ranger School, through her deployment, through every moment when quitting seemed easier than breathing. She carried them now, even as Harwick tried to break her. Kessler's mother had stopped speaking to her after the funeral. Not because of grief, though that hung between them like smoke, but because Kessler had enlisted 2 months after they buried her father. "You're killing me twice," her mother had said, her voice hollow as an empty church. They hadn't spoken in 4 years. Every holiday, every birthday passed in silence. Kessler sent cards that never got answered. She called numbers that rang into nothing. Her brother, Marcus, had tried to bridge the gap, but he was fighting his own wars in college, trying to become the civilian success their mother desperately needed. The night before the evaluation that would end with Harwick taking her rifle, Kessler had called Marcus from the barracks payphone. The connection crackled with distance and bad wiring. "You should come home," Marcus had said. He sounded tired, older than 23. "Mom's not getting better. She needs you." But home was a place Kessler couldn't reach anymore, not without abandoning everything she'd bled for. "Tell her I love her," Kessler had whispered, and hung up before he could argue. She'd grown up in Telluride, Colorado, in a house that smelled like pine and her father's gun-cleaning solvent. He'd taught her to shoot when she was 7, setting up cans on fence posts behind their property while her mother watched from the kitchen window, her face tight with disapproval she never voiced. By 12, Kessler could field strip a rifle faster than most adults. By 15, she'd won 3 state marksmanship competitions. Her father had been so proud. He'd put every trophy on a shelf in his study, arranged them like soldiers in formation. After he died, her mother had boxed up the trophies and stored them in the garage. She'd painted over the study, turning it into a sewing room she never used. She'd erased him slowly, methodically, like she was trying to rewrite history. Kessler understood the impulse. Grief made people desperate to control something, anything, but she couldn't forgive it. Her father had lived for service, for honor, for the belief that some things were worth dying for. His daughter had inherited that belief like a genetic disorder. Now, standing in the Nevada desert with Harwick's contempt burning hotter than the sun, Kessler felt her father's ghost beside her. He taught her more than shooting. He taught her how to read people, how to spot weakness in their stance, how to turn an opponent's strength into vulnerability. "Combat isn't about muscles," he'd said once, showing her how to redirect force instead of matching it. "It's about timing, leverage, and the will to do what others won't." She'd dismissed it as old man wisdom back then. Now, with 8 SEALs closing in, she finally understood what he'd meant. Harwick had planned this moment for weeks. Kessler had seen it in his eyes during every evaluation, every field exercise where he'd pushed her harder than anyone else, waiting for her to break. He'd grown up in a military family that stretched back 4 generations, all men, all decorated, all believers in the old way of doing things. Women in combat roles offended something deep in his core, something he'd never examined because it felt like truth. The other candidates had noticed too. During evening downtime in the rec room, Kessler had overheard conversations that stopped when she entered. Reeves, one of Harwick's favorite SEALs, had been in the middle of a story. "Commander's got a pool going," he'd said to Torres. "How long before she quits? I got $50 on week 7. Torres had laughed, then spotted Kessler in the doorway. The room had gone silent, and she'd turned around without a word. The isolation had become its own form of warfare. In combat, you knew who the enemy was. Here, the enemy wore friendly uniforms and smiled while sharpening knives behind their backs. Only Chun had remained neutral, and even he kept his distance. During a night navigation exercise through the mountains, when Kessler had twisted her ankle on loose scree and fallen behind, Chun had waited at the next checkpoint. He hadn't helped her, hadn't said anything, just made sure she wasn't alone in the dark. It was the smallest kindness, but it had kept her human. Graves, her bunkmate, had finally broken silence one night after Kessler had returned late from a punishment detail Harwick had assigned, cleaning the armory until every weapon gleamed. "He's setting you up for something," Graves had said without looking up from her rifle. "I've seen it before. Different people, same pattern. He finds someone who threatens his worldview and manufactures their failure." Kessler had asked what happened to those people. Graves had shrugged. "Most quit. Some break. One guy fought back and got discharged for insubordination." The message was clear. There was no winning this game. But Kessler wasn't playing by Harwick's rules anymore. 2 weeks before the confrontation, she'd started training differently. Instead of trying to match the men's strength, she'd focused on speed, precision, and economy of movement. She'd studied judo videos on the rec room computer, watched hours of footage showing how smaller fighters could dismantle larger opponents. She'd practiced in the dark hours before dawn, using shadows as sparring partners, drilling techniques until they lived in her muscle memory deeper than thought. She didn't know what Harwick was planning, but she was preparing for war. The timer started with a beep that cut through the desert air like a knife. Maddox came first, a bull of a man with shoulders wide enough to block the sun. He moved fast for someone his size, closing the distance in 3 strides, his fist already cocked back for a haymaker that would end this before it began. Kessler didn't retreat. She stepped inside his reach, her body dropping low, and swept her leg behind his ankle exactly as he committed his weight forward. Physics did the rest. 230 pounds of Navy SEAL hit the sand hard enough to create a small dust cloud. Before Maddox could process what happened, Reeves and Torres attacked from both sides, trying to pin her in a coordinated grab that should have worked. Kessler spun between them, her elbow catching Reeves in the solar plexus with surgical precision. The air left his lungs in a whoosh of surprise and pain. Torres grabbed her shoulder from behind, his grip like steel, and she let him think he had her. Then she dropped her weight, twisted, and drove her heel into his kneecap at the exact angle that hyperextends ligaments. He went down with a grunt that sounded like a question. Chun approached more carefully, his hands up in a proper fighting stance, respect flickering in his eyes. He feinted left, then right, testing her reactions. She stayed centered, breathing steady, watching his shoulders for the tell that would show his real intention. When he committed to a low takedown, she used his momentum against him, redirecting his charge with a hip throw that sent him tumbling into Kovac, who'd been circling for an opening. Both men crashed into each other with the sound of armor colliding. Samuels and Brinks came together, trying to overwhelm her with coordinated strikes. A high punch from Samuels, a low sweep from Brinks. She ducked the punch, jumped the sweep, and in the half-second they were off balance, she struck. Palm strike to Samuels's jaw, just hard enough to rattle his brain. Heel kick to Brinks's chest, pushing him back into the training yard's fence with a metallic clang. The entire sequence took 8 seconds. 8 SEALs on the ground or staggering, and Kessler standing in the center of the chaos like the eye of a hurricane. Dutch, the last man standing, raised his hands in surrender. He was the oldest of the group, a veteran of 3 tours who'd seen enough combat to recognize something extraordinary when it happened. The timer beeped again. 73 seconds had elapsed. The training yard had gone completely silent. Other candidates stood frozen, their mouths open, their exercises forgotten. Harwick's face had turned the color of old meat. His hands trembled slightly where they gripped Kessler's rifle. She walked toward him, her breathing steady, her eyes locked on his. When she reached him, she extended her hand. "My rifle, sir." Her voice carried across the entire base, clear as a bell on Sunday morning. Harwick didn't move for 10 seconds that stretched like hours. The rifle stayed raised above his head, his pride keeping it hostage even as logic screamed at him to yield. Around them, the training yard remained frozen in the moment after an explosion, everyone waiting for the dust to settle and the casualties to be counted. Kessler didn't lower her hand. She didn't blink. She'd learned patience in ambush positions, lying in filth for 16 hours waiting for a target to appear. She could outwait any man when victory depended on it. Finally, Harwick lowered the rifle. He didn't hand it to her directly. Instead, he placed it on the ground between them, a compromise that let him preserve some fragment of authority. Kessler picked it up slowly, checking the chamber and magazine with practiced efficiency, every movement deliberate. Behind her, the 8 SEALs were climbing to their feet, dusting sand from their uniforms. Maddox rubbed his lower back. Torres limped slightly. Chun caught her eye and nodded once. The same nod he'd given her after the hostage rescue scenario, but deeper now, weighted with something that looked like brotherhood. The rest of the day moved like a dream underwater. Other candidates approached her in the mess hall, their hostility replaced by curiosity and grudging respect. A ranger named Crost sat across from her during lunch, sliding his tray next to hers. "That thing you did to Torres," he said. "That's Krav Maga, right?" She shook her head. "Aikido. My father taught me. He said the best fighters don't add force to force. They redirect it." Crost nodded thoughtfully, then asked if she'd show him the technique. By dinner, 6 more candidates had made similar requests. Graves waited until they were alone in the barracks before speaking. "You just painted a target on your back bigger than Texas," she said, her hands still working her rifle cloth in methodical circles. "Harwick's not going to forget today. Men like him never do." Kessler sat on her bunk, her body finally registering the adrenaline crash. Her hands shook slightly. Her ankle throbbed where she'd pivoted. Small cuts on her knuckles leaked thin lines of blood. "I know," she said quietly, "but I'm tired of making myself smaller to fit into spaces that were never built for me." That night, she tried calling Marcus again, but the line just rang and rang. She wanted to tell someone what had happened, wanted to hear her father's voice even though that was impossible, wanted her mother to understand that this moment of standing her ground was exactly what he died protecting. The right to prove yourself. The right to be measured by your actions instead of your gender. The right to fight for something bigger than yourself. But the phone just rang into emptiness, and eventually, she hung up and sat in the dark, holding her rifle across her lap like a child she'd almost lost. Harwick's revenge came 3 days later during a live-fire exercise in the mountain range north of the base. The scenario was simple. Hostage rescue in a mock village, multiple hostiles, limited ammunition, 0 room for error. Candidates went through in pairs, their performance recorded and graded by observers with clipboards and cold eyes. When the roster was posted, Kessler's name appeared next to Reeves, one of Harwick's most loyal SEALs, the same man who'd bet money on when she'd quit. The village sprawled across a rocky hillside, plywood buildings painted to look like Afghan compounds, shipping containers arranged to create kill zones and choke points. Somewhere inside, 3 mannequins with orange vests represented hostages. Somewhere else, instructors with simulated weapons waited to grade their response to live threats. Reeves checked his ammunition twice, his movements sharp and professional. He didn't look at Kessler, didn't acknowledge her existence beyond what was necessary for the mission. They entered through the south breach point, moving in tactical formation through doorways that smelled like dust and old wood. Kessler took point, her rifle up, her breathing controlled. Behind her, Reeves moved with the fluid grace of someone who'd cleared real buildings in real wars. They reached the first corner, and she signaled the turn. That's when she heard it. A sound that didn't belong, metal scraping against stone from behind them, not in front where the threat was supposed to be. She spun just as Reeves lowered his weapon, his face blank as paper. From the shadows, Maddox and Torres emerged, their training weapons raised and pointed directly at her head. Not at the hostages. Not at the theoretical enemy. Her. Simulation failure. Harwick's voice crackled through the loudspeaker system. Kessler made enemy contact and failed to engage. But she hadn't failed. She'd been set up, placed in a scenario where her own teammate could betray her, while the commander crafted a narrative of incompetence. Rage burned through her veins like acid. She lowered her rifle slowly, her eyes moving from Reeves to the hidden cameras she knew were recording everything. "That wasn't the exercise," she said clearly. Her voice projected toward the microphones. "That was a fabrication designed to manufacture failure." Harwick's laughter echoed through the speakers, harsh and triumphant. "In combat, Sergeant, the enemy doesn't follow your expected script. You failed to adapt. Report to my office at 1800 hours for remedial review." The words were a trap within a trap, and they both knew it. 1800 hours. The sun hung low over the desert, painting everything in shades of blood and gold. Kessler stood outside Harwick's office, her uniform pressed sharp enough to cut, her spine straight as a rifle barrel. Through the door, she heard voices. Multiple men, conspiratorial tones, the sound of a verdict being prepared before the trial had begun. She thought about walking away, about quitting like everyone expected, about returning to her mother's house in Colorado and apologizing for believing she could be something more than acceptable. Then she thought about her father's last letter, creased and worn from 4 years, in her wallet. She thought about every girl who'd been told she couldn't, every woman who'd been measured against standards designed to exclude her, every human who'd fought to prove their existence mattered beyond the categories others assigned them. She knocked on the door 3 times, sharp and clear as gunshots. The voices inside went silent. Harwick sat behind his desk with Maddox, Reeves, Torres, Kovac, and Dutch flanking him like an informal tribunal. The office was spare. Steel furniture, filing cabinets, a flag in the corner, commendations covering one wall like scales of metal fish. He gestured to the single chair facing his desk. "Sit." She remained standing. His jaw tightened. "I said sit, Sergeant." She met his eyes without blinking. "I'd prefer to stand, sir." The word "sir" carried just enough edge to be insubordination without crossing into open disrespect. "You've become a problem," Harwick said, his voice cold and measured. "Your actions during the hostage rescue scenario demonstrated poor judgment and compromised team cohesion. I'm recommending your removal from the program, effective immediately." The words should have devastated her, should have confirmed every fear that had haunted her since arriving at this place. Instead, she felt something click into place, like a weapon being loaded. "With respect, Commander, that's not what happened, and we both know it." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Maddox shifted his weight. Torres looked at his boots. Only Dutch held her gaze with something that might have been curiosity. Harwick leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk. "Are you calling me a liar, Sergeant?" This was the cliff edge, the point of no return. One more word and she'd be court-martialed for insubordination. But silence was its own kind of death, slower and more painful than any official punishment. She took a breath and made her choice. "I'm calling it what it was, sir. A setup. You wanted me to fail from the moment I arrived, and when I didn't, you manufactured failure. That's not leadership. That's cowardice." The silence that followed her words felt like standing in an avalanche's path, watching the mountain break apart and knowing nowhere was safe. Harwick stood slowly, his chair scraping against concrete with a sound like bones grinding. His face had gone beyond anger into something colder, more dangerous. The look of a man whose entire identity had just been challenged by someone he considered beneath acknowledgement. The SEALs behind him tensed, ready to move on his command, ready to bury her under regulations and consequences until she disappeared. But then Dutch spoke. "She's right, Commander." Every head in the room turned toward him like he'd just pulled a grenade's pin. Dutch was 42 years old, a Master Chief with 20 years of service, a man whose opinion carried weight earned through 100 missions and more scars than he could count. "I've been watching since she arrived. You've been running a different standard on her. Different tests, different criteria, different consequences for the same mistakes everyone else makes." Harwick's eyes narrowed to slits. "Master Chief, you're out of line." "Maybe," Dutch continued, his voice steady as bedrock, "but I took an oath to support and defend. and I've watched you violate that oath every day with this woman. She's outperformed 60% of the candidates here. She earned her place. And that hostage rescue scenario today. I reviewed the footage. Reeves deliberately compromised the exercise on your orders. That's not training. That's sabotage. Reeves made a small sound, half protest, half confession. Harwick's face had turned purple, veins standing out on his forehead like topographic maps of fury. Then Chun stepped forward. He's not alone in seeing it, sir. Several of us have discussed your conduct regarding Sergeant Kessler. It's created a hostile environment that undermines mission readiness. Kovac nodded. Even Maddox, who'd come at her first during the 73-second fight, wouldn't meet Harwick's eyes. The tide was turning, the wall of masculine solidarity cracking under the weight of truth that could no longer be ignored. Harwick looked around the room, seeing his authority dissolve like smoke in wind. "This is mutiny," he said, his voice barely controlled. "All of you will face consequences." Dutch shook his head. "This is accountability, sir. Something you've forgotten in your crusade against progress." He turned to Kessler. "Sergeant, I'm formally requesting you be reinstated with full standing in this program. I'll submit paperwork through the proper channels. If Commander Harwick wants to fight this, he can explain his conduct to command." Harwick grabbed his phone, his hand shaking with rage. "Get out. All of you. Kessler, you're confined to barracks pending investigation." But his voice had lost its power. The room knew who'd won this fight before it officially ended. The investigation took 6 weeks. Officers from higher command arrived with briefcases and recorders, interviewing every candidate, reviewing footage, reading reports. Kessler spent the time in barracks limbo, her future suspended between vindication and destruction. Graves kept her company when regulations allowed, saying little but offering her presence like a gift. Marcus finally called back and told her their mother had asked about her, the first question in 4 years. "What did you tell her?" Kessler asked. "That you're fighting," he said. She nodded like she understood. The verdict came down on a Thursday morning when the desert air still held night's coolness. General Matthias himself delivered it in Harwick's office, which felt appropriate given that this was where the war had been declared. "Commander Harwick is being reassigned to administrative duties pending retirement," Matthias said, his voice carrying the weight of 3 decades in uniform. His conduct violated several regulations regarding equal treatment and created a hostile training environment. "Sergeant Kessler, you're reinstated with full standing. Additionally, you're receiving a commendation for exceptional performance under adverse conditions." Harwick sat behind his desk looking smaller somehow, diminished by consequences he'd never imagined would reach him. He didn't look at her. Matthias continued. "Master Chief Dutch will assume command of this training cycle. He's implemented new oversight protocols to ensure this doesn't happen again. Kessler, if you choose to continue, you have my personal support." She didn't hesitate. "I'll continue, sir." Matthias smiled, a slight crack in his professional facade. "I expected nothing less. Your father would be proud." The rest of the training cycle passed like wine through open spaces. Difficult, demanding, but clean in a way it hadn't been before. Dutch ran a fair program. The candidates responded by performing better, pushing harder, supporting each other instead of tearing each other down. Kessler graduated 3rd in her class, behind Chen and a ranger who'd grown up in Alaska hunting bears. At the ceremony, with her mother watching from the audience beside Marcus, both of them crying quietly, she finally felt her father's ghost release her. She'd carried his memory this far. Now she could carry herself. Chun approached her afterward, his dress uniform sharp in the Nevada sun. "You changed this place," he said. "Not just for you. For everyone who comes after." She shook her head. "Dutch changed it. You all changed it by speaking up." He smiled. "You gave us permission to speak. That's leadership, Sergeant. Whether you recognize it or not." They shook hands, and she felt the weight of respect between them. Not because she'd proven herself to him, but because they'd proven themselves to each other. That night, Kessler drove into the desert alone, parked on a ridge overlooking the valley, and unfolded her father's letter one last time. Be better than they think you can be, it read. Then be better than that. She'd done both. But more importantly, she'd learned something he hadn't written. That being better sometimes meant standing still and refusing to shrink. That strength wasn't just muscle and marksmanship, but also the courage to demand dignity. She refolded the letter, placed it back in her wallet, and drove back toward the lights of the base. Behind her, the desert stretched empty and infinite. Ahead, her life waited, finally her own to write. The end. Drop a comment below if this story moved you. Tell me what moment hit hardest. And remember, the people who try to break you are usually just afraid of what you'll become if you don't break. Stay unbreakable.